Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Oh, let my people.
My name is Ron Kettleson. I'm president of the Sharon Historical Society. And on behalf of our group, we'd like to thank you for participating tonight in our Underground Railroad program. We're really excited to have Ken Jones with us. Ken is the town and village historian of Esperance, New York. He's written several books on local history, including Sam the Gallow Bird. It's a story of a Schoharie black resident who was hung for murder in Fonda, New York in 1878. Ken is a charter member and currently the president of the Esperance Historical Society and Museum. Ken is also the chairman of the Commission on Archives and History for the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. And he's currently working part-time for procurement services at the University of Albany SUNY. So we're really excited to have Ken tonight. And Ken, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can go ahead and share yours and go ahead and get started.
Okay. Well, welcome to Exploring the Underground Railroad in Schoharie County. We're going to start by looking at a map of Schoharie County so you get an idea. It's kind of in central New York State. The original settlers of Schoharie County were Palatine Germans. They were basically brought over from England as indentured servants to make military stores to pay off their trip from England to the colonies in 1710, and then came to Schoharie after there was the finances had dried up for the project and they were left on their own. They decided that Schoharie was the promised land that they had been promised by the Queen of England and settled here, but did not have proper property rights, and that had been a long time dispute. So the Palatines came here, and they're always referred to as the poor Palatines, but they're also the Dutch, the Romans that settled around the same time that were had wealth and basically had slaves that they brought with them, where it would be quite some time before the Palatines would have had money to do that. Now, as we look at the lay of the land here, we see Schoharie is next to Albany County. We're about 25 miles from the capital city. Down below, we see on the southeast, we're next to Greene County, and on the southwest, we have Delaware County. The directly west is Otsego, north is Montgomery, and northeast is Schenectady. To get a feel for, what did the historians say about Schoharie County and slavery, we're going to start out with Jephthah Sims, who was a famous historian in these parts. And in 1845, he was basically saying that, they were treated as a member of the family. And if you didn't notice the color, you would think they were treated equally as any other member of the family would have been. Most of the Schoharie families, of course, did not have large plantations, but small farms of around 100 acres. Because the Palatines were not affluent, they didn't have slaves when they first settled here around 1712. The Dutch, the Vromans, and the other families brought their slaves with them. But the Palatines, right up until about 1760, were pretty financially strapped and just trying to make their way. There's a lot of history behind land disputes and problems the Palatines had, and they're always referred to as the poor Palatines, even back when before they came over here. So they were no different here. They were poor off. And here we see John Peter Niskern, one of the what is called list masters, who settled Niskernsdorf. He was called a list master because he was responsible at the camps on the Hudson where they're supposed to be making military stores. He was in charge of their supplies and tools and supervision. But when he moved to the Scary Valley in 1746, he made out his will. And in his will, he doesn't even own a wheeled carriage, and there are no slaves yet in his will. To give another idea so that they could afford a slave, the early Palatines didn't have horses either. And there's a whole story about how they acquired a horse, and there's a little storybook that's been written on they had a horse. And basically they shared the ownership of that horse. And here we see a person by the name of Swart, Josiah Swart, who's selling his 1/3 ownership in a female slave and her child. So in order to afford a slave, they went in on a partial ownership here. Here you had 3 partners sharing the ownership of one female slave and her child. William Roscoe, another historian of Scurry County, he wrote, "The Negroes of both sexes were admitted into the family, which belonged upon equal footing with the white members, and appreciated the kindness shown to them by their masters." So we're getting the idea that the slaves in Scurry County didn't have it too bad. They're treated, as one of the families. We know the Dutch in particular, when they took over basically New York, when they settled New York, that the slaves were in a better standing in the community than when the English took over and became more of a what do you want to call a property than a person. Now, we just got through saying how the historians are telling us that they were treated as a member of the family. And here we see a story of the old Vroman house in Schoharie, which is still a showplace near the historic stone fort in Schoharie and the newly built covered bridge that's there. And they say one of the women in Peter Vroman's house, in a fit of temper, pushed a slave girl down the cellar steps. And as a slave fell, she struck her head on the masonry and died. It wasn't long before the Scary slaves were also running away. They weren't waiting for the Underground Railroad. They were taking flight to gain their own freedom. And here in 1774, we see a typical advertisement of a runaway slave. Some had a lot of money, depending on the value they had of the slave. Some were very small, but sometimes they placed the ad just to be on the safe side in case the slave incurred any debts. It wouldn't come back onto them because they placed a notice that the slave had run away. And this particular slave looks like it was a slave that was pretty well dressed, possibly a house servant. Most of the Schoharie families, if they had a slave, only had 1 or 2 slaves. And they're very expensive, as noted. This one was evidently dressed well and had plated buckles on their good shoes. Here is another runaway slave notice. This one's a lot later. This one is actually from Albany in 1812. And we notice in this slave ad for a runaway slave that the slave ran away with an infant named Diana, and she'd asked permission to visit her children in Scary County, which was granted to her. So this tells you that the families were being separated. It wasn't like they kept their families together. They were being sold and separated. Here we see that the slave Fan is trying to gain her freedom by telling her master that she wants to visit her children that were separated from her in Schoharie. It's hard to come up with firsthand accounts of slaves in New York State, especially in this region, because of course they couldn't read or write. But Thomas James was illiterate and well-known minister. And basically he grew up in Canajoharie, which is north of where I am here in Schoharie County. And in Canajoharie, he was born in 1804. And he talks about the fact that he was a slave, and that his mother and sister, and actually his brother as well, were sold away. And his mother, to get away from the people that were going to buy her, ran up into what they called the garret, what we would call the attic, and tried to hide there. But they found her and tied her up and put her with the new owner. And that's the last that Thomas James saw of his mother and sister, and never saw them again. Afterwards, he mentions that he was sold with the rest of the property after his master died in an accident, and his new master owned him but a few months when he was sold, or rather traded, to George Hess of Fort Plain, which is also in Montgomery County. He says, I was bartered for a yoke of steers, a colt, and some additional property. Later, he says, which is very important to think about when we read about or catch on to little clues to do with the Underground Railroad. Again, it was an illegal activity. They didn't have, signs out that this is a, place that is a safe house, just like when they had Prohibition. You had to know someone in order to get a drink. In the same way here, you had to know your way through to get safely to freedom. But he mentions that Mr. Hess was going to whip him, and to avoid the whipping, he ran away and followed the newly staked trail of the Erie Canal. So the Erie Canal was being built around 1817 until about 1821 or so, and then opened fully in 1825. So he was probably, if he was 17, that makes it 1821. So somewhere around 1825, he was probably following the newly staked trail of the Erie Canal. Now, the Erie Canal runs from Albany to Buffalo. This is another sale of a slave. Now, this particular sale was between a Mr. Cottle and a Joshua Reed. Now, they're both this happens to be from 1822, kind of late in the process of slavery in New York. But what is interesting is that Joshua Reed was the uncle of a prominent person in his family that wanted to get a teaching job. So he arranged for his niece to get a teaching job in Canajoharie. And his niece was none other than Susan B. Anthony. And of course, she became later on a famous suffragette and also an abolitionist. But her uncle was the opposite. He was dealing in slaves here in 1822. He'd already sold a male slave, and here he's buying a slave named Marianne. We're going to talk now about gradual abolition in New York, starting, as you see in this slide. 1781 is when they started with the manumitting of slaves. That means the freeing of slaves after they served in the military. And then there was a law passed about exporting and importing slaves into New York State. And when slaves were freed by their master, some laws required them to provide a bond. In other words, if they were trying to dispose of a slave, for example, that had aged out and was no longer of value, this prevented them from doing that and having that slave become a burden to the poor master or to the municipality. So they would have to come up with a bond if they were going to manumit a slave. Later that was changed. In 1799, we start with the first real gradual emancipation acts. And this one in 1799 allowed for males to be freed after they've served their master and are at the age of 28, and females to the age of 25, and indentured servants to the age of 21. Now, indentured servants could also be orphans and people that have been assigned to a journeyman of some kind and learn a trade that no longer had parental support, and the poor master had put them with someone, and they were an indentured servant. As part of the legislation in 1799 for the gradual emancipation of slaves in New York, it allowed the slaveholder to basically put up any unwanted slave child with the overseer of the poor to become a pauper of that particular town. Because what would happen is they would be raising a slave, and then eventually when the slave was of age, it would be free, so they wouldn't get the value of the slave. So this was a way for the New York State government to kind of offset the financial loss of the act they passed in 1799. But also what it meant was the state was paying about $2 a month, and a mother could lose her slave child without any say-so in the matter, and that slave child could be put with someone else, and that someone else would receive the $2 a month. Now, a lot of times they had trouble finding a place for the slave child, so it was put back with the original farmer. And this continued to about 1806 when it became too expensive in the state budget. In 1817, Daniel Tompkins, who was governor of New York and transitioning to become vice president of the United States, encouraged the state legislature to free the slaves effective July 4th of 1827, both those born before 1799 and those born after, and that law did pass. Now, what happened was in 1821, there was a state constitutional convention. And at that convention, this issue of slavery came up. And one of the petitions was to have an amendment to the state constitution stating that basically slavery was not allowed in New York. But they had already freed the slaves effective in the laws of 1817. So some of them didn't want that word slavery in the Constitution. The language was, we don't want to blacken the face of the Constitution with slavery. But one of the locals from Schoharie that was at the Constitutional Convention, Mr. Briggs, said, they'll know whether we had slavery in New York, whether we blacken the Constitution or not. So it sounds like they're very much looking to move forward with putting the slavery behind them in New York. However, at that same constitutional convention, white males could only vote in New York State if they owned like $100 approximately worth of property. So that constitutional convention, they did away with that. So the white males didn't have to own property. They just had to meet all the other citizen requirements in order to vote. However, they took it upon themselves to impose a $250 property requirement for black males. So black males would have to own $250 worth of taxable property. So that meant most of your black males could not vote in New York State. The second constitutional convention was around 1846. And here we see a town meeting notice from the black residents of Schoharie going on Spring Street, which was a heavily populated street of blacks in Schoharie in the village. And they're holding a meeting to basically push for the right to vote. And to do away with that $250 requirement. Unfortunately, even though they were pushing for it, they again had no vote and had no weight, and the Constitutional Convention denied their right to vote. And this continued until the 1867 New York State Constitution, after they all fought in the Civil War, and again they were denied. So it was not until 1870 when the US Constitution was amended that blacks got the right to vote, males that is, in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But even after emancipation, former slaves were at risk if they went into the southern states. One former slave by the name of Prince Mattice from Schoharie County ended up down south and basically was arrested and put in jail. The people of Athens, where he was living at the time, went to see the governor, and the governor was away, and they said to themselves, we'll get the money up. And they raised $80 and sent one of their members down, and Prince Mattice was released from prison and brought back north. Now, what happened the next year is that this became a real issue, and a law was passed authorizing the governor of New York to protect the citizens from being kidnapped or reduced to slavery in the South. And this was used in the Solomon Northrop case. And most of you have heard of 12 Years a Slave. That was the story of Solomon Northrop. And Prince Mattice was a previous version, except he was lucky and didn't get kept there for a long period of time, just the time that he was in jail waiting for them to come and rescue them. Now we're going to talk about the churches fracturing in New York State. This happened a lot in this area. The first one was Reverend Gilbert McMaster, was a minister in the Reformed Presbyterian Church in Duanesburg, which is only about 6 miles from here. And by legislative resolutions, he said that Congress has the authority to abolish slavery, and we're pushing our New York legislation to do that. But the Reformed Presbyterian Church didn't want to get involved in politics. They felt because the Constitution didn't recognize Jesus as the head of the nation, that they shouldn't be involved in voting or public office. So this agitation on the issue of slavery ended up splitting the Reformed Presbyterian Church in 1833. Congressman Briggs of Massachusetts was approached to present some petitions based on the fact that there were people sending petitions from all over the country, especially after 1833. 1833 was about when the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed. All of a sudden, there's a flood of petitions coming to the Congress stating that they want, no slaves, and they want slavery abolished in Washington, D.C. They don't want the new states coming into the Union to be slave states. So there's a lot of agitation. All this stuff is coming down onto Congress, and it's becoming quite a hot point between the North and the South. So one of the Southern congressmen by the name of Pinckney from the Carolinas put up a House rule that any of these petitions that come in for slavery to be abolished in DC were to go to a select committee. And then the select committee would basically tell whoever wrote that they didn't have the power to abolish slavery in DC. The first time, one of the early times this happened, it was based on a petition that Mr. Briggs was bringing before Congress, and Mr. Wise, a congressman from Virginia, said, let's not accept this. And he said, let's take a vote. He didn't want to accept the petition. And the Speaker of the House was going to call a vote when it was overruled because they'd already passed this rule. And Mr. Wise was very upset, even chewing out his fellow Southern congressman, because he had this petition from the Virginia legislature that he wanted to present, but was not able to because of this new rule. These rules became called the gag rules. And we'll see how these gag rules were used also in the churches. And basically what is interesting about this one in particular is that petition was from Schoharie. One of the interesting things that happened in this part of the program over the fracture of the churches is what happened at this church in Stone Arabia in Montgomery County from the Lutheran Church. It was the installation of Reverend J.D. Lawyer. He was an abolitionist member of eventually in Sand Lake, New York, where they were preaching. But he was appointed to Montgomery County churches, Stone Arabia, Minden, and Palatine. And Reverend Lintner was from Schoharie, Middleburg, and Cobleskill. And this is the installation of Reverend Lawyer, who was ironically a real lawyer. He was a lawyer in Schoharie County, became the county clerk, and then decided he wanted to get into the ministry and became a minister in the Lutheran Church. Shortly thereafter, he became the head of the synod, which was called the Hartwick Synod. It was formed in 1830. And in 1836, one of their members brought a petition that they wanted the Lutheran Church to take a stand on slavery. And like taking the cue from the gag laws that we saw in Congress, the synod decided to table it. In fact, there was another motion that they should remain silent on the issue because there was a lot of chances that this would agitate and split the church or affect how the church operated when it came to the Lutheran Church, in the South. So because they took an action of tabling, the ones that wanted this petition passed split off because they couldn't see how they could belong to that synod, because they felt the church could not remain silent without sinning. In other words, the church needed to take a stand against the evil of slavery. So this group split off from that synod and formed the Frankian Synod, which was formed in 1837, right after the previous meeting. And it was the first such synod in the United States Lutheran Church that took this stand for slavery. And basically, they started to try and grow their organization and get other churches to join. Reverend John D. Lawyer, who was one of the leaders in this group, published in The Friend of Man, which was a local abolitionist paper, that the timely action of the Frankian Synod will be a matter of rejoicing to the friends of the oppressed. The minister of this body, Mr. Lawyer, says, are all abolitionists. This is the Lutheran Herald, that was their newspaper. They also put out a call to all the other Lutheran synods to join them in taking a stand against slavery. The response to that call was very weak. They ended up being the only synod of their kind for about 20 years. One of the first things that Reverend Lawyer did after the formation of the synod was to be appointed the head of the synod and also allowed to ordain clergy. One of the first clergymen he ordained was Daniel Alexander Payne, who was a Black man who had been going to the Lutheran seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. While he was there, he was told about this synod that was in upstate New York, and that it might be a place for him to go. So Daniel Alexander Payne went to the Frankian Synod and was ordained by John D. Lawyer in 1837. Because there wasn't a local Lutheran church for him to serve, at that time the Lutheran Synod included Montgomery, Schoharie, and Rensselaer County for the most part. And in Rensselaer County is the city of Troy. And in the city of Troy, Daniel Alexander Payne found the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church, or African Presbyterian Church, and started preaching there. He also later left the Lutherans and joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was hesitant to join the AME Church because they frowned upon clergy that had gone to seminary. So he was hesitant to do that, but eventually decided to join the AME Church, and later became a bishop in the AME Church and the first Black president of a college and the president of Wilberforce University that was managed by the AME Church. This is a Liberty Street Presbyterian Church in Troy, where he was preaching in 1837. He also formed a moral organization there. And it's interesting because there's a sign out front about 1840, I believe, that says that Henry Highland Garnett was the first preacher. Well, actually, Alexander Payne was. And we don't know how many years before this there was actually Liberty Street Presbyterian Church. It may be that it existed even before Payne got there, but he was followed when he left by Henry Highland Garnett, who was a very famous Black abolitionist and the first Black man to speak at Congress in the United States. Reverend Philip Whiting was one of the members of the Frankian church that had formed, and he had the towns of Seward and Sharon churches. Now, because of this split in with the Frankians, not all the churches were happy about this. They didn't want to be a part of this Frankian synod. So his two churches, he decided he would try and keep the Seward Church in his synod and allow the Sharon Church to go to be with the other synod, which was called the Hartwick Synod. But unfortunately, the Hartwick Synod decided both those churches were theirs and took it to court, and Whiting lost his church. So he had a large congregation. They built a new church in Gardnersville. And John D. Lawyer, being an attorney, wrote a 20-page dissertation to the judge who had made that decision. Basically, the judge was finding out who were, quote unquote, the true Lutherans. And so there was quite a disruption here. Some of the ministers that were in this Frankian synod were basically people from Schoharie County that started this synod. They were Ottmans, MPs, Van Alstynes, and lawyers, early names found in Schoharie Valley. One of the other things they wanted to push was missionary work. So they right away started a mission in Sharon, Wisconsin. People from Sharon, New York, went there and were led by Reverend MP, who established a Frankian Lutheran church there. Again, if they're all abolitionists, this means the abolitionist movement within the Lutheran church is moving outside New York. Reverend Nicholas Van Alstyne was another minister who also was involved in the Underground Railroad and was a member of the Frankian Synod. He took the name as Paul from the Bible as his code name, and often scriptures and hymns in the church had special meetings for those people in the pews so that they knew what was going to be happening. His father, unfortunately, was one of the early men to suffer the execution on the gallows at Schoharie for the murder of Deputy Huddleston, was serving papers for debts owed against the farm that they had owned. The Methodist Church in 1836 passed their own rules, trying to keep a lid on things. In other words, a gag rule like we saw at Congress, in which it advised all ministers and members to wholly refrain from discussing the slavery question. Reverend Luther Lee, who is hosting, his church was a host church for their particular meeting they were having of the conference, when one of the members charged him with being an abolitionist. Eventually, he withdrew the charges, but Lee decided with others that they needed to leave the Methodist Church, and they formed the Wesleyan Methodist Church in 1843. Luther Lee was its first leader and was an agent of the Underground Railroad. He moved to Syracuse in the spring of '52 and did what he called the largest work of my life on the Underground Railroad. I passed as many as 30 slaves through my hands in a month. And Reverend Luther Lee was born in Schoharie County. John Quincy Adams was president of the United States, but at this point he's in Congress. He's serving in Congress. And when the gag rule comes into play, it has to be renewed every congressional session. So in between times, he makes sure to get in some of these abolitionist petitions. And there's a couple in these groups that he's presenting, one from the town of Jefferson and one from a little hamlet in Franklinton, where 31 people have signed on to this petition that he's bringing before the US Congress. The other Lutheran group we talked about was the Hartwick Synod. Now, Reverend George Lintner was the minister in Schoharie, and he had, as we saw before, installed John D. Lawyer, who is now basically his enemy, and they're even trying to steal sheep or take members of his churches away from him. So you would think that he would be very much an anti-abolitionist, but his journal exists, and he was for promoting any good work of any of the churches in the area. So what's interesting is that there is an action in 1839 when there's a meeting of the anti-slavery society, and there's a request has been made in 1839 by a Reverend Cross to preach in the churches in the Schoharie Valley and tell them about what they're up to. And he actually is allowed by George Lintner to preach at the church in Schoharie. And that's quite open of Mr. Lintner to allow, basically the people that are tearing his churches apart to come and preach in his church in Schoharie. Now, Reverend Cross was a congregational minister, and he was an agent of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. So he was a full-time abolitionist at this point. So he basically goes to Quaker Street, New York, in Schenectady County, and sends a report in as to what's going on. And he says that he was holding a meeting in Ames, which is just north of Schoharie County and Montgomery County. And the host backed out that was supposed to allow him to have his meeting. And the minister and the church and the congregation were driven out of the church sanctuary to a barn, which was at once made the place of prayer. Now, the abolitionists that were doing these preaching sites were very often, they'd throw stones, they'd break into the meetings and try and break them up. They would, beat the ministers. They would try and set buildings on fire while they're in there. They did all kinds of things to disrupt these abolitionist meetings. So Reverend Cross has been kicked out of the Ames Church where he's supposed to be preaching. And then he says, my next appointment, I came to Schoharie. He says, where abolitionists, if not dead, was in such a deep death slumber that I doubted whether anything short of Gabriel's trump would rouse it into action. After 3 services on the Sabbath, 2 of which were especially devoted to the cause of freedom, considered the prospect so unpromising as scarcely to warrant the effort of forming a county society, concluding therefore to let the dead bury the dead without staying myself to attend the funeral. And that's basically what most historians would think would happen in Schoharie, is that would be what he would run into, that there would be no interest in hearing about an abolitionist and their work. However, he said he was starting for Greene County. Now, Greene County is at the bottom of this map. You can see it's at the southeast corner of Schoharie County, and he's heading for there. And he says, I'm going through Livingstonville, which is to this day a small hamlet in the town of Broome. And he says, accordingly, I visited Livingstonville, and I found a little leaven, which means he found something that was going to rise. It's another word for yeast. And he resolved to make one more effort in Old Schoharie. Accordingly, he visited the principal places in the county and lectured where he could find an opportunity. And yesterday, we organized a Schoharie County Anti-Slavery Society under more favorable auspices than we could have anticipated from the indications where I first arrived. So he's surprised. He goes into Livingstonville and finds that there's an abolitionist group. Of course, there was an anti-slavery society already in Livingstonville, and there were some active people in that group that encouraged him to try one more time. This is the community church in Livingstonville. James Boyd was an active member here. There was also congregational ministers in the area that were active, and this is where he was when he decided to give them another chance. Shortly after that, in 1840, we find a colored state convention that's going to happen in 1840. Now, we haven't talked about the black abolitionists, but there was black anti-slavery societies in amongst the groups in Albany. And Reverend Charles B. Ray called a meeting of this colored state convention. Now, some of his white supporters were concerned that of an all-black organizational meeting, that might not be how it might look to the other white people, basically. And he decided to go ahead with that. And basically, when I read the meeting minutes, I thought it was going to be about slavery, and it was not. It was about getting the right to vote. They wanted to get the right to vote. So it just shows you how strong in New York the feeling was that they needed to do away with this $250 tax, basically, so that they could be free to vote. And one of the themes of the meeting was who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Charles B. Ray was also a minister who married Abel Brown, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. Here's one of the meeting notices that was in the paper that shows who the officers were in Scary County. We've got Dr. Marinas from Leesville, who was a very adamant abolitionist, right to the point of when he died, he left money for education of blacks. And also Dr. Marinas was a Baptist and was an agent for the Baptist Free Missions. So in 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, a lot of blacks started moving who had settled. They might have come up through Albany and then stayed like in Scary, because there's a large black population. We probably had 600 blacks and less than 30,000 people in the county at that time. So some of them just stayed here. But if they realized that now they weren't safe, they would start heading for Canada. And Dr. Marinas raised over $3,000 in supplies for the slaves that had gone to Canada for their support. Dr. Van Alstyne was a relative of Reverend Van Alstyne and was a doctor in Richmondville. And Chester LaSalle owned LaSalle Hall, which was a tavern on the main road in Schoharie near Spring Street that we saw before, where the black families, one of the sections of the village where the black families lived in Schoharie. Schoharie and Middleburg were the two large black settlements in Schoharie County, with hundreds of blacks in each one of those communities, at least 100 in Middleburg and probably 200 or 300 in the town of Schoharie. In September of 1843, Abel Brown and Charles Torrey. Charles Torrey was known as the father of the Underground Railroad, and Abel Brown was the local regional organizer for they formed what was called the Northeastern New York Anti-Slavery Society. And because of the formation, Abel Brown was able to leave his pulpit. He had been a professional abolitionist agent before in Massachusetts, and for a year or so took a break from wearing himself out by being a preacher in Sand Lake, New York, and left the Sand Lake Church to become an abolitionist again at large. And here he's meeting with Charles Torrey, another abolitionist organizer. Now, what's important is to see what Torrey did. In 1842, it organized an elaborate railroad route. So before, that's where we get the organized a part of the Underground Railroad. Previously, the blacks were doing what they could. They would probably be helped out by Quakers, but now you had what was called an organized way of doing this. They sent out agents to these societies that tell them how to operate their societies to promote the abolitionist cause, and I'm assuming also to how to help out the slaves that were coming through. But those kinds of things, of course, were illegal and weren't, published in the paper. But basically he and his assistant Thomas Smallwood, a free black, together they solicited slaves in Washington to run away and then transported them north to Pennsylvania. And they're mostly went to safe houses owned by Quakers. So remember that they were owned by Quakers. A lot of these places they stopped at. And they went from there to Philadelphia and Albany and ultimately to Canada. Sometimes they had as many as 15 or 20 slaves in a wagon that they took out of the slave states. And they targeted Southern members of Congress and important political figures so as to cause as much disruption as possible. So now you got, they're poking the tiger. You've got these agents are taking some of the cream of the crop slaves from these wealthy slave owners. So you can imagine they're not happy and they're going to take action. Miss Lawrence was a lady from Schoharie that was going to help with a mission cause in her hometown. There was a lot of blacks living there and whites and Aborigines living together with they called them sloughters in Schoharie County, which was a negative term for these mixed race people that lived in the hills around Schoharie. And as a missionary, she was going to open up a Sunday school for the children up there and teach them how to read. Well, she ends up teaching an adult woman named Mary, and she mentions in her biography called Life Sketch that this Mary was from the South and appeared to have lived with a family of intelligence and refinement. So here we see a possibility. We see slaves being brought up from the high wealthy congressmen and those types. And then when they get to Schoharie, you've got hundreds of blacks living there and just basically blending in with them. This would have been in 1840s before the Fugitive Slave Act. Here we see the Sand Lake Baptist Church, where Reverend Brown was pastor. So far we've seen by historical references that the Frankian pastors, Nicholas Van Alstyne and Dr. James Marinas, were probably running safe houses, as well as Luther Lee, who had left Schoharie and was operating a safe house out towards Syracuse. And it would strongly appear that Deacon James Boyd, now Deacon Boyd was from Livingstonville, as we mentioned, where the Levin was. And when his wife died, they had moved closer to Syracuse. And in Frederick Douglass's paper, it published her obituary. And in there it said that she was a special friend of the slave and had a scripture reading about, her helping the least of these. You did it unto me. So basically, it was pretty clear from the obituary that Mrs. Boyd had been assisting the slaves. And again, as Dr. Van Alstyne, who was a leader of the Frankians, and Reverend Lawyer, Reverend Lawyer said all their ministers are abolitionists. So you can imagine there was a good, strong chance that where one of these Frankian ministers was located was also a place of refuge. From the capital, Abel Brown's next appointment was Quaker Street in Schenectady County, and then they were going to Schoharie to meet in the courthouse. Now, in some cases, the abolitionists couldn't find a place to meet in the churches, so they would apply and meet in the courthouse. Here in Schoharie, Abel Brown writes in a letter to his wife that they're meeting in Schoharie, and that Lewis Washington, his associate, traveling companion and former slave, is giving a talk on what slavery was like and really capturing their attention. And he says in his letter that he had to stop writing because of the impact the speech was having on him, that he could no longer write and had to absorb the talk that Mr. Washington was giving. Now, Lewis Washington was mainly giving speeches, but he was also sent independently to Schoharie to help run a meeting. But what is important to know is that Abel Brown would promote the Liberty Party, the abolitionist parties at the time. And so he would get, stoned and thrown out, where Lewis Washington, because he was just telling his story, his life story, would be allowed to speak. The Anti-Slavery Society split around 1840 because of women's rights, not being allowed to speak at the meetings or have a vote. Abel Brown and his group were the ones that wanted to see change brought through action by political parties and by Congress, where the other ones wanted moral persuasion, or basically you would just, somehow persuade people that slavery was bad and should be ending. But Abel Brown was very active And they were going to have a Liberty Party meeting in Leesville, which is the other hotbed. We talked about Livingstonville. Leesville is at the opposite end of the county, and was also an abolitionist hotbed, and that's where Dr. Marinas lived. And there was a notice in the paper, is it not time for the abolitionists to arouse themselves and come to this abolitionist political meeting? Now, unfortunately, the two leaders we talked about, Charles Torrey and Abel Brown, died early in 1846 and 1844, respectively, both in their 30s. Charles Torrey, like I said, he was really good. He's a real good organizer. How good was he? Well, they arrested him and threw him in jail for his work down south, and he ended up dying in prison. Abel Brown was wearing himself out physically, and while trying to get a place to rest in the bad weather, got exposure, got to finally a friendly place he could stay at, and weakened and died at their home. And so by 1845, the Northeastern Anti-Slavery Society is becoming inactive. So John D. Lawyer and James Marinas get together, and they decide they're going to form a Christian anti-slavery society in Ames. And ironically, Ames was where we had the people thrown out of the church and into a barn. And they're going to have a meeting there for the surrounding counties, churches that have a similar view on slavery to meet. And attending that was Reverend Post from the Baptist Church in Leesville, and some of the Frankian ministers in Allstein and Ottman. Their next meeting was going to be in Amsterdam, and they were going to draft a protest to be sent to all the churches in New York. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that the Quakers were very active in this anti-slavery movement, and they wrote in a history of their Society of Friends in New York that the impartial historian will talk about how the overthrow of slavery started through their activities. We talked about Quaker Street. It's in Schenectady. It's only about 6 or 7 miles from where I am right now. Ebenezer Wright of Quaker Street was an earnest supporter of the Abolitionist Party, and with John Sheldon, James Sheldon, and Mr. Briggs acted as agents for the Underground Railroad, assisting slaves on their way to Canada and freedom. And this was published in a double county history in 1886. We see in the picture the Quaker Meeting House that was built in 1807. What's significant here is how many agents were in this little town. You've got 4. So it just gives you an idea of the volume. According to Abel Brown in 1842, he had something like 350 slaves went through Albany under the Underground Railroad that year. Marjorie Hogue, who wrote a history of the meeting house, said that the slaves came from Queens and Rensselaerville. Queens Landing is on the Hudson River below Albany, so they probably came up the Hudson to Queens and then Rensselaerville. And Rensselaerville is right near Livingstonville as well. And she says they went up also to Charleston Four Corners. So they would have gone through the Esperance part of Schoharie County and went up 162 to Charleston, where there was another Quaker settlement to take these former slaves to freedom. This is a historic home from the 1600s in Queens that they believe may have been one of the safe houses. Again, it was on the Hudson River. It was a good location for a safe house on the Underground Railroad. When they came to Quaker Street, this is this plank house, meaning that it was made with planks. So it's a very thick house. They're put on top of one another. And then as they're offset, they put the plaster on. But this house belonged to one of the members of the Quaker meeting that was converted this into a safe house. And she was reporting 1965. Now her first writing was in 1944. In 1965, she's saying they came from Queens, and the next place was north of Esperance on their way to Canada. And the north of Esperance would be Charleston Four Corners, another Quaker settlement. Here is a cottage gingerbread house in Charleston Four Corners that they think may have been a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, this was not far from the Erie Canal. We talked about Reverend Thomas James taking the newly staked trail of the Erie Canal, and this would be just south a ways of the Erie Canal. Here's a sign for the Friends Meeting. The Friends Meeting House is no longer standing in the Charleston Four Corners, but there still is a cemetery you can see in the background from the Friends Meeting. Now, as you go further up, this house, the Frey House at Palatine Bridge in Montgomery County, is on the Erie Canal, backs up to the Erie Canal. Now, when you're trying to find a safe house, there's a lot of people that say, you know, their barn, like there's one in Middleburg in Scary County. There's a barn that they found rooms underneath, but they haven't been able to tie it to an abolitionist person or family. So that's some of the things we look for if you're going to try and identify a safe house. Is either it's historically identified as such, or they've actually pinpointed it based on the fact that there's a family story and there's other connections. Now in the Fry House, now this is F-R-E-Y, it's pronounced Fry. The Frys came to New York in 1688. They were from Switzerland. And the family stayed there. And this, they had an old house that they built along the Hudson and replaced it in 1739, and it became a fort. That building is still there. Around 1808, they had more money and they built this nice house closer to the road. And this is the house has a tunnel running down to the Erie Canal and the Mohawk River. Here we see a picture of the basement of the house, and the arrow points to an opening that I actually crawled into, and it goes only a short ways and hits the foundation wall, but on your left is a short wall, and there is an oil tank. In the 1980s, the oil furnace was put in and blocked the exit from the house into the tunnel that leads out. Now, according to the landscapers, there's still an entrance you can get to from the Mohawk River into the basement of this house. Now, what is interesting about this is not just this story about the tunnel, is the fact that John Fry, who lived here, was the vice president of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. So here we've got, you know, a story that was on there. We've got evidence of a tunnel leading to the Mohawk River and the Erie Canal. And we also know that the person owning this was an officer in the anti-slavery movement. This is the inside of the house. I was given a tour recently, and this is a historic mantelpiece in the home. And if you look carefully, you'll see down halfway down the sides there, it says 1688 on one side, 1888 on the other. This was put in on the 200th anniversary of the family coming to America from Switzerland. Now, if we get a close-up of that mantelpiece in the center, we see on the left a symbol for Switzerland. The flag has, I believe, a red cross on it, and the Swiss knife, and we see a boat in the water. But what is really interesting is the German words that are on this, which is Ich bin frei. Now, F-R-E-I and F-R-E-Y, the family name, are both pronounced Fry. But Ich bin frei means I am free. And this doesn't mean I'm free like I can do what I want, or, you know, I've got time to do things. It means you're free from something in the German language, free from prison, or in this case, possibly free from slavery. The other part of that history of Schenectady County, while we talked about the lady that wrote the history of the Quaker Meeting House, Mrs. Hoag, we also found the history of the Quakers in the history of Montgomery or Albany and Schenectady counties. And in that history, it goes on to say, after Quaker Street, the next station west was the house of Mr. Griggs, a miller at Schoharie. And John P. Griggs was born in 1797 in the town of Esperance, operated a ferry near Sloansville, and the censuses show him in the town of Carlisle. But eventually, around 1844, he purchases a Peter Vroman house in Mills. Ironically, this is the same house where he talked about the slave girl getting kicked down the stairs and hitting her head against the masonry and dying. But now it's a safe house, And when it was advertised for sale in 1860, they said there were 3 families could fit in here. And when Mr. Griggs lived there, he did have about 3 families, and he had an active mill business. But this was identified as a safe house on the Underground Railroad, right in Schoharie, where we thought there would never be any kind of abolitionist type Underground Railroad activity. Here's a artistical drawing, gives you an idea. The yellow house in the foreground is the Vroman House, and you see the stone fort, historic building in the background. Sharon Springs, of course, we saw Leesville, which was an earlier settlement than Sharon Springs, but Sharon became an abolitionist hotbed. Basically, they said that during a political campaign, that if the abolitionists were having a meeting and there was 1,000 people showing up, and then they were going to have a Democratic meeting, and they said there wouldn't be enough people to raise a Liberty pole, which meant each political party raised a pole made of wood, the Liberty Party. The Democrats used a hickory pole, and basically said there would only be not enough people to even put the pole up, and they would put their banner on there. But so it's likely that there was another route that was coming from what we call the Lunenburg Turnpike, which runs like from Rensselaerville, we talked about Livingstonville, up through Richmondville towards Sharon, where we know there was strong abolitionist activity, and James Marinas was said to have been managing a safe house as well. Before 1850, you'd not be surprised to see the slaves settle in Schoharie, but after 1850, some of them probably started to move on. In one letter we have from 1842, a gentleman who was studying to be an attorney in Middleburg says that he was surprised that it was inhabited by a great number of Negroes. There were probably nearly 100 in this village, meaning Middleburg, and Schoharie was a much larger Black population. Here on this map, we see some of the areas we've been talking about. You can see where Queman's over on the right is on the Hudson River in Albany County. And then you see coming over to the left in Albany County is Rensselaerville. And then in the town of Broome, we see Livingstonville, Franklinton. And then if you head up at a diagonal, you'll be going through Richmondville to Leesville. Now, if you head straight north from Rensselaerville, you'll head towards Quaker Street, and Quaker Street is where they would go through Esperance and up to Charleston Four Corners, and then up to the Erie Canal. So you could either go up the Erie Canal or take, if Sharon is on the Great Western Turnpike, you could either take the turnpike, head west through New York, or head onto the Erie Canal. The early poems and stories of those times talk about Niagara Falls. So it seems like a lot of the slaves went through and crossed Canada at Niagara Falls, or they left Albany and went through Rensselaer County and went up to Vermont and up through Canada that way. I think that ends what I have for you today. The attachment you'll get later, and we'll have a lot of detail about people that were involved in the area on the Underground Railroad. So I guess I'll open it up now to our questions if we have any, and I'll ask our host to read all the questions that have come up. Any maps that exist. This is kind of a new territory we're exploring today. There hasn't been a lot of deep dive research in this area because it was just assumed, because of the strong Democratic presence, that there wasn't much activity here.
Okay. Are all of the safe houses preserved as historic buildings?
Most of the safe houses we looked at today are all private residences, and they are being preserved by their owners, but they are all private residences.
Were the anti-slavery societies mostly associated with the Lutheran Church?
No, the Lutheran Church ministers felt they were their own anti-slavery society. So there are two different groups. You had the anti-slavery society members, and you had the Lutheran Church members. And basically, there are two separate groups. John D. Lawyer and those people felt the church was itself an anti-slavery society.
So we have a person that grew up in Sharon Springs. They wanted to know if there was any connection uh, to the Beekman House, which is or the Beekman Mansion out on the edge of town. I've not heard of anything. Have you?
Judge Beekman was a slaveholder. I don't know that there's after him. I don't, from what I understand, it wouldn't be him that would have been harboring slaves because he had them. I think, wouldn't he die in 1830s, I think?
Yes.
And I don't know who had it after him, but I'm not aware of that.
Okay. They want to know if they can tour the Underground Railroad. If there's a map of which is there is not, and the like, for instance, the home that we were showing uh, in uh, in the Palatine Bridge is not. These are all private residents, so they're not open to the public. It's just I happen to know the lady that owns the house, and so Ken and I were able to go in, and in that case, it's just a really interesting house, and it's wonderful that so much of it has been preserved. It's unfortunate that the tunnel has been blocked because when they put that oil tank in, they ended up blocking the passageway, but you can come from the riverside, and it's very obvious where the tunnel goes because in the summer the grass doesn't grow over. It's just kind of a brown spot where the tunnel is underneath. What's the distance between Schoharie County and Montgomery County?
I'm where I sit in Esperance. I'm probably about 2 or 3 miles from the county line. So Sharon Springs, again, you're very close to the county line, and Leesville is very close to the county line in Montgomery County. So Ames, we talked about Ames. Ames and Leesville are very close to each other.
Did the Fugitive Slave Act have an effect? Uh, let's see, make the slaves move out to Canada.
Yes, when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, panic, from what I can understand, took place, and our friend Alexander Payne, the bishop of the AME Church, got together with Frederick Douglass, and they're going to decide, should we tell people to stay or tell people to run to Canada? Because some of the leaders, the black leaders, that is, of the abolitionist movement had already left for Canada. So there's a mass exodus, apparently, around 1850, where people had been comfortable in the northern states and were no longer comfortable and headed for Canada.
Do you have information on the Underground Railroad in other parts of New York? This person grew up between Binghamton and Elmira, right on the New York-Pennsylvania border. They've heard of houses in the towns there and that were likely part of the Underground Railroad. Now, there is an Underground Railroad website, isn't there, for in New York?
Right. In Peterborough, there's a Abolitionist Hall of Fame museum where Smith lived. So that organization there probably has a lot on it. The Capital Region has an Underground Railroad Society, and they're preserving Mr. Myers's home, who was a black abolitionist and a black leader in the abolitionist movement. So there are other historical groups that are dedicated to this topic that may have more detailed information of other regions.
Did the Fugitive Slave Act affect the fleeing slaves or the free black folks?
It affected the slaves because what happened was they were being forced, all the people in the states by law were supposed to help capture a fugitive slave in their town. Now, what happened was they didn't obey the law. And in Troy and other places, there were famous incidences where in the courtroom, the black slave would be, all of a sudden something would happen and they'd hustle the slave out of the courtroom and send him to freedom. So basically what was happening was by law, all of the free white people and free blacks were supposed to help capture runaway slaves that were in their territory.
The synod at Hartwick Seminary is mentioned. how did this come into play with other area abolitionists? I think it was mentioned, but I didn't connect the dots.
Hartwick Seminary was built by the Hartwick Synod of the Lutheran Church. And basically, the Hartwick Lutherans were those that did not want to rock the boat, so to speak, and make a big issue out of slavery, but rather keep quiet about it so that churches don't split. Where the Frankians were part of that. John D. Lawyer was the leader of the Hartwick Synod at the time, and basically he was the one that led the split. But as far as a region around Hartwick, Mr. Ottman, one of the Frankian ministers, his son, I think, was going to school out there and was the leader of the Anti-Slavery Society out by Hartwick Seminary. So they did have, people. In fact, I think at one time the church there was being taken over by the Frankians, and it was a very contentious thing where they had this going on between the ones that wanted to keep it quiet and the ones that wanted to agitate the subject.
It said, did fugitive slaves find work or transportation on the Erie Canal?
Fugitive slaves would probably have followed the canal. I don't know if they could find work or not. It depended on who they were with. And again, it depends on how organized the Anti-Slavery Society was. In other words, it's possible they had a ship's captain on one of the boats that would allow them, to ride the boat up the canal. And again, it depended on the organization. And if you follow some of these other histories of the anti-slavery movement written from other regions of the state, which do exist, you'll read more about it and find out how the slaves were continued on the canal or went, west on the highway. But I imagine most of the time they tried to go when they weren't going to be obviously seen.
Okay. Well, that looks like that's the end of the questions. And I really appreciate your time, Ken, and thank you for, sharing such an interesting program. If you want to contact Ken, there's his email address. We are going to be, this presentation was recorded. It will be put on the Historical Society website. You'll receive an email once that's up. It will give you access to the recording of this presentation, as well as Ken has prepared a supporting document that you can read at your leisure. Our next programs coming up are March 8th and March 22nd. It's Railroads in Schoharie County. It's presented by Bob Holt. And then there's a program on the Wild West, miners, cowboys, gunslingers, saloon madams, and ghost towns. I will be presenting that presentation on the 22nd. Those are available for registration, and you will receive links to those. If you haven't already, you should have received an email. It was sent out a little bit ago. And here's the upcoming presentation. So you can see we've got quite a variety, everything from, we've got some quilts, history preserved in quilts. We have history of ice cream, the story of the Statue of Liberty, a Jewish life in Sharon Springs, story of the Adler Hotel, and the assassination of John F. Kennedy 58 years later. So we have, and Santa Claus in December. So we have quite a bit coming up in the next several months. And since you registered on this or for this presentation, you'll get an automatic email from Eventbrite when these are available. And there's the information for the Historical Society. Again, we apologize for the problem that we had. We did purchase adequate licenses for the people, but for some reason, Zoom just would not allow us to get in. So thank you, everyone, for your participation tonight. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next presentation. And thank you again, Ken, for your time to present tonight.
You're welcome, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Have a good evening, everyone.